Okay, great. Well, NWSOFA, which is the host of tonight's meeting, is an indivisible chapter. We're one of 6,500 across the US. NWS stands for the Northwest Suburbs of Chicago. OFA is Organizing for Action. The group is organized in a dual snowflake principle. On the right-hand side, you'll see the blue snowflake, where are all the issue groups. We have 10 different issue groups. On the left-hand side, we have 8 different communication groups and 8 subgroups. And just kind of going around the issue groups, just to keep you aware of them all. If we start right in the center left on the blue, you see the words ROD, that stands for Restore Our Democracy. They work on voting rights, elections, gerrymandering, and vote by mail. And then a new division of ROD is combined with our confronting of disinformation that started a couple of years ago at school boards and now is generally confronting disinformation. We have a very active group, our longest term group on gun violence prevention. And we have healthcare reform team, immigration reform team, social justice, and then continuing around that circle, our Stand With Women group, which has been very, very active. You can imagine over the last couple of years, particularly this last year on the abortion issues. And then we have a fiscal and economics group, which keeps us updated every month on the newest information on jobs, on GDP, on unemployment, all the key economic indicators. And then we do a lot of election outreach, more and more, it seems like every year, federal, state, and then recently local. And then we have climate change, which is why we're here tonight. The secret sauce of our organization is 23 different leaders that work on these issue groups and on our communications group. And they work tirelessly, just bringing new ideas and thoughts in. And they are very active in what they're doing and how they get it done. So that's kind of the secret sauce. And I'll turn it back to Mark now, who is our climate change lead and does a tremendous job every month coming up with something either mainstream on climate change or part of the environment outreach, which has been so important over the last few years. So Mark, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome everybody to this month's climate change meeting. I'm finding that it's very, very interesting that things seem to come to me, and that would be the case in tonight's program when Fred Miller gets on, hopefully shortly, and Jerry Songer I've been working with on some of the other things. But when you look at that snowflake, it's with NWSOFA-Indivisible, it's kind of like a mobile. If you pull on one thing, it seems to vibrate with a lot of the other issues. So these things are all connected. I went back to school some years ago and got an environmental degree. And I'm reflecting now that almost all that was kind of theoretical. You really couldn't see what was happening. When I actually started working in the field, it was a lot of emergency response. So you were working to try to correct or remediate the problems that had happened. One of my bosses told me, he said, well, it must be real. Well, he said, please understand there are no environmentalists working for this company. And it was an environmental and infrastructure company. And I thought that was funny at the time because I consider myself to be an environmentalist, but some of those people working in the field consider that as a pejorative. They view environmentalists as, you know, futurists or tree huggers or something like that. And I think that we can probably be both, but environmental health and safety aspect of it, and I had to go get my OSHA 40-hour training, was a real eye-opener for me. And when Fred Miller comes on here, he will talk about that. They put you through OSHA 40-hour training and you find out all kinds of things about hazardous materials that you didn't know before. And it will scare the bejesus out of you, but it will also make you think on maybe taking a look at your own situation, finding out if there's things you should be doing in your own house, things your company should be doing, things your community should be doing. And I know that's one of the reasons that Jerry Sanger got involved with the rail transportation stuff, because we have all kinds of things going through our neighborhoods and our transportation stuff. Dangerous goods are being transported. We have factories making stuff around us. We don't even know what half of it is. So we need to be aware of some of this and see what we can do. If there's legislation, we need to get involved in lobbying to try to correct and prevent catastrophes. So that's my 2 cents for the night. And so I will turn my attention over to Jerry Sanger and let her maybe carry on with this.
Our campaign is called La Coalition Rail Safety Campaign. We are with the Woods and Wetlands Group with the Sierra Club, Illinois chapter. And this, we've actually been in an adopted campaign for the past 2 years. And it's the can of worms does not stop. It hasn't stopped since I started working on this in 2014. Well, yeah, I think it was May of 2014. And I'll just kind of bring you up to date a little bit on some of the recent issues that have come to light. I don't know if any of you are aware of this. I wasn't. I think if you know much about the railroad industry, you may know this already, but apparently railroads have their own private police. This has really become a big issue in Canada because an attorney by the name of Tavengwa Renyoa, he is representing the families of 3 deceased railroad workers. There was a whistleblower report filed in Canada this year, I think the beginning of this year. And the report states that Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, I believe, don't quote me on the railroad. I believe it was both of them. It may be one or the other, but I believe it was both of them. But I want to say that I'm not positive, so I don't want to come across as for sure on that. But one, if not both of those railroads used their own private police to cover up evidence that could have led to wrongful doing in a criminal investigation. Now, these are the same railroad companies that come right through the United States. So this is something that we should care about also, especially since the STB just approved a merger between Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern. So that also raises the question of, through a business transaction, Canadian Pacific increased its private police force simply by doing business with American companies. So, oh, I think you're on.
Fred is here. He's muted, but hooray, Fred.
Hooray. Well, I can talk more about that because I think really the feature person here is going to be Fred.
Fred, please give yourself a little introduction for the people who may not know about you here. So,
okay, well, I've just tried most of my life to look exactly like you, it looks like.
Indeed.
which I promise I was not prepared for. But anyway, I did shake my beard, successfully. In any case, I'm a longtime expert on issues about transporting of dangerous cargoes and chemical plant disasters, and I worked many years as an environmentalist with Friends of the Earth, and I was the head of their toxic catastrophe program for many years. And, we had a whole lot of work to do on chlorine and toxic gases. And after the Bhopal disaster in 1984 in India, that killed 8,000 people overnight. And in effect, luckily for America, it was an American company, American Cyanamide, that killed all those people overnight. And so a lot of Americans said, well, it could happen here. Sort of like what's happening right now with the East Palestine derailment. I mean, we had 3 solid weeks of daily coverage on the Washington Post about that East Palestine derailment, which was actually a fairly small event and in a tiny little town. But obviously there were a lot of people behind the scenes that were asking themselves, could it happen in my town or in a big city? And so what could that look like if it was a really serious release? So in any case, after working a lot on toxics, then I also did some work on LNG and other kinds of dangerous cargoes. And I've worked on chemical facilities and been a consultant also on transportation issues. And so I'm just basically, I'm one of these experts that people define expert as meaning somebody who knows more and more about less and less. And so I'm happy to be with you guys and contribute in whatever way I can to your issues.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about SARA legislation. The fact that we are supposed to have a right to know, but you explained that as soon as that legislation was passed, the railroad and trucking industries exempted themselves from that legislation, and the state emergency response commissions and the local emergency response committees were never set up to actually work. So I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that, the history of that legislation. Okay,
well, that is a very important issue, but the main thing it's important to know is that Congress, after the Bhopal disaster, could not pass a bill. They were not strong enough, even though they were very upset, could not pass a bill to put controls on the chemical industry, the chemical facilities in the United States, like the Bhopal facility. They couldn't put in real prevention legislation, but the best they could do was do community right to know, which means at least we can try to get information from the company. And first of all, what do they have on their plant sites, which up to then, companies just wouldn't tell you. I mean, they just say, there's no law that forces me out. Get out of my face, Mr. Millar, right? And so basically, that was all. It was an important experiment, is what Congress did. They passed a law called EPCA, the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act of 1986. It was part of the larger SARA law, but EPCA set up. Again, it was a noble experiment. They set up 4,100 local emergency planning committees around the country. And the first law in 1986, EPCA said that the companies, 12,500 chemical companies are still complying with this law to provide to the local emergency planning committees what they've got on their sites in terms of, the inventory of the most dangerous chemicals. Well, but the local emergency planning committees, very soon, many of environmentalists joined local emergency planning committees hoping they would work. Well, they wouldn't work. They won't work. They don't work. And I was on the one in Washington, D.C., and I can elaborate on why we know that's not going to work. But in any case, the short story is we tried that and it did not work. And so we went back to Congress in 1990 and said, we need a tougher law. And so Congress said, well, look, we'll force the facilities to calculate worst case accident scenarios of their most dangerous chemicals on the site and report that to the local emergency planning committees. Well, because the local emergency planning committees would not calculate that on their own. The local emergency planning committees were volunteers. They weren't paid by the Congress or by the feds. They were just a little volunteer committees that are made of several different kinds of groups were supposed to be on it. It's supposed to have broad representation. Industry wasn't supposed to dominate it, but in fact they did. Because they had no other money, sometimes industry would contribute, and most of the time they were completely unfunded, and they soon gave up even meeting, many of them. There were originally 4,100. Now I was told by EPA yesterday there's about this week that there were about 3,000 left. But they hardly even meet, and then when they do meet, they just tick off something on their resume about I was on the local emergency planning committee. So the industry has been providing, again, to the local emergency planning committees, the facilities. What happened in the very beginning was that the LNG industry got itself exempted from a community right to know because EPA decided that, well, that's a very tiny little industry and they're going to be regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and by PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration within DOT. And therefore, we at EPA, we're not going to put them on the list of regulated facilities. They did have a list of the most the most dangerous regulated chemical facilities, and included a lot of different kinds of facilities, but not LNG. Also, the transportation industry. I mean, what happened was that, look, they just do what they do. They went into Congress and said, you shouldn't regulate us. And Congress said, okay. Now, I mean, what kind of sense does this make? You can have a chlorine gas tank car on your plant site, in your town, or just outside your town, or wherever. A lot of them are in communities. Some of the most dangerous facilities are, in fact, in communities. You can have one chlorine tank car that if released, could put out a cloud over your city, like we found out in Washington, D.C., and I'll explain that. The industry's own consultants can calculate that just one chlorine tank car, if released, can put out a cloud over Washington, D.C., 40 miles long. Now, it won't kill people that far away, but it's I mean, chlorine was the gas used against troops and each other in World War I, right? So it's a deadly gas. It's a biocide. And so basically, here's the situation. So if you have that on your plant site, it falls under the law. And you have to report it to the local emergency planning committee. But if you take that same chlorine tank car and whiz it around the country at 50 miles an hour through major cities, you don't have to tell anybody. I mean, basically, the transportation industry got itself exempted. I mean, this is an industry, folks, who operates. I mean, you know, we pretend that we're trying to have democracy and capitalism, democracy with capitalism. We're pretending that's what we're trying to do. Let me explain to you a little anecdote about this from our work, which is that when the Obama administration, after a big train disaster in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, killed 47 people overnight, and that's just because there were 2 birthday parties in a town. This happened at 1 a.m. I mean, this town was virtually deserted, except for 2 little birthday parties at the music cafe that was celebrating their friends' birthdays. Well, you know, life is not fair. When some smokers went outside to smoke, they heard this gigantic crash, and they instinctively ran up the hill. And it was a crash of the railroad tank cars, 60 of them, piling into their little town. And they ran up the hill only to look back and watch all of their friends burn up. That was Lac-Mégantic, Quebec. Now, that scared a lot of people around the country in terms of educating people about what could happen in a really serious wreck, but in a very small town. And so the Obama administration was called on to do some regulations, and they did a very weak set of regulations, and including a very weak routing regulation for the high hazard flammable trains, the most dangerous trains. And they restricted that to a smaller number. And the point that is so instructive is that at the end of that rulemaking process, you know, the rulemaking process generally involves industry people and government experts getting together in quiet meetings in secret rooms and talking about what each side will accept. And then they come out with some kind of a compromise, right? So I mean, sometimes one side or the other will hold firm and force the other to agree. But I mean, the point is, that is the procedure. At the end of this rulemaking process on high hazard flammable trains, President Obama, the DOT staffers, snuck in a very useful safety concept called electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, ECP braking systems. Now, they're a very good set of, it's a fairly new technology. It's only 5 or 10 years old, but the railroad industry had been experimenting with it and said, yeah, these are really good brakes. I mean, these brakes stop trains faster. So that's what you need. If you got a train running through the country and a wheel gets on fire, you know, you get a hot box or whatever. I mean, that could cause a huge derailment. The main thing is to stop the damn train in a hurry. Well, what we're operating with in the United States is ECP brakes had been investigated by the railroad industry, and they decided not to adopt it because it was costly, more costly than the brakes they were operating with, which were air brakes, right? And these air brakes stop the train more slowly because the air has to travel from one end of the train down to the other end of the train in order to in order to engage all the brakes. Well, so Obama sneaked in a mandate that the railroads should adopt ECP braking. And the railroads were furious. They went to Obama and said, that's not the way things are supposed to operate in this town. You didn't even tell us about that you were going to put in this regulation. And he said, well, yeah, that's right. I got it in though, didn't I? That just illustrates what we've got there. The railroads run things. I mean, they spend millions and millions on their lobbyists, and they win and they win and they win. So I mean, what do we expect when we got a system that allows you to have corporations and wealthy people paying the politicians, contributing to politicians' campaigns? I mean, that's what we've got, right? So in any case, and that was just a small illustration of the overall problem. We've had years and years of public concerns about ultra-hazardous chemical facilities and ultra-hazardous chemical transportation. And we have not made very many serious dents in that situation. Let me give you one example. In Washington, D.C., I actually did join the local emergency planning committee back in the day in the 1990s, with the hopes that I could contribute and help make it work. And I was on a little committee to investigate the chemical plants in Washington, D.C. So I took my little subcommittee to the sewage plant. It's called Blue Plains, the wastewater treatment plant. And they had state-of-the-art facility, beautiful facility. The manager was very proud. He took us on a tour of the site. He showed us that on his site, he had 10 loaded chlorine gas tank cars on his site in Washington, D.C. And he told us that he only used one a week. When we got into his office, I said, sir, if you only use one chlorine tank car per week, how come you got 10 sitting out here? Well, he said to me, well, Dr. Miller, you kind of got me. He was professional enough to be embarrassed. Well, you kind of got me. He said, I kind of got a sale on chlorine, so I kind of stocked up. Now, that's the way it is out there. These people don't, until they're regulated and enforced, they don't do anything. So we went to the DC City Council and said, this is ridiculous. The Sierra Club actually published a photo of the chlorine gas tank car coming through Washington, D.C. on the CSX rail line. The CSX rail line goes through Richmond, Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Wilmington, and on the west side of the Hudson River through New York City. The Eastern Urban Corridor. That's the CSX rail line, and that's how they make money. They rent out their line to these cargoes, right? It's a freight line, and so as well as some passengers. But so basically, we went to the DC Council and said, this is extraordinarily unsafe and invites terrorism to be bringing cargoes clearly placarded with big placards saying chlorine, and with a number about how toxic it was, and you shouldn't allow this in Washington, D.C. So the D.C. Council passed an ordinance, a rerouting ordinance, that was going to force the railroads to go that told CSX, if you don't have an origin or destination of this dangerous cargo, we listed several of the most dangerous cargoes. If you don't have an origin or destination in Washington, D.C., go around. Well, see, there's another railroad. The Norfolk Southern Railroad also has a line up the East Coast, and it goes through little towns like Luray, Virginia. And so CSX said, what, you want us to give our precious chemical cargo where we make a lot of money over to that competitor railroad, Norfolk Southern? And we said, yes, sir, that's exactly what we insist that you do. I mean, the Washington City Council voted 9-1. Only one Republican lady voted against it. That's because she thought some Republican up high, her friend, was going to save us on this. Well, they didn't. And so basically, the council passed a very good rerouting law. 6 other major cities around the country, Chicago and other places, introduced a similar law based on exactly on the DC law. I mean, for big cities, this seemed to be a good idea. What do you know? It seems like the most basic safety thing you can do is protective urban rerouting. And so when CSX says, you want us to reroute, give our cargo over that competitor railroad, we said yes. Well, then we did a little research and found out that in the United States, that's called interchanging your cargoes between the two railroads. They interchange cargoes. It turns out that this is the lifeblood of the North American railroad industry, Canadian and US. They interchange their cargoes, I was told by a railroad person, about 1 million times a year. A million times a year, they already interchange their cargoes, and they were making it sound like we're causing them such pain, right? I mean, the fact is, they interchange their cargoes when they're commercially profitable mutually for the railroads. They don't want any government telling them to do something. You know, that sort of sounds like a little socialism, doesn't it? They don't want any government telling them to do anything for safety reasons. Oh my God. So basically, then what happened? Then what happened was the DC Council refused to spend more money to use. There's an alternative chemical they could use, and we pointed out in the sewage plant, which is bleach. Instead of killing the biological little organisms in your wastewater, with chlorine gas, you could use bleach. Bleach you could pour it in your hand and nobody gets killed, right? I mean, bleach is not toxic. What any toxic gas cloud? I mean, you wouldn't drink it, but it's not a toxic gas cloud. But DC refused to pay the extra money until the terrorists hit the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and fell into that field in Pennsylvania. When the terrorists mounted a credible terrorist attack, people in DC and the government said, you know, maybe it does make sense that we don't bring chlorine gas tank cars into Washington, D.C. with a Sierra Club photo showing it moving through D.C. with the U.S. Capitol building 4 blocks in the background of the rail line, 4 blocks. And like I say, the facility's own consultant had shown that one chlorine tank car, if released, could put out a cloud 40 miles long into the suburbs. Well, so after they hit the Pentagon, what do you know? We switched immediately to bleach, and in fact, the insurance companies must be putting pressure on sewage plants around the country, because very many municipal sewage facilities have switched, and other kinds of facilities that use chlorine have switched away to safer chemicals. I mean, that's called inherently safer technology, IST, inherently safer technology. And that's something that environmental groups have been pushing a lot recently, because there's plenty of cases where you can do something safer than chlorine or hydrogen fluoride or anhydrous ammonia or the really bad stuff. There's plenty of alternatives that industry could be using. So in any case, what we did find out, however, is that, you know, this noble experiment from the Congress of the local emergency planning committees just didn't work. In fact, I sometimes say, my experience is, and I've talked to lots of LEPC people and lots of environmentalists who joined LEPCs only to quit in disgust because they wouldn't do their job. And here's the reason why they wouldn't do their job. They were made up of volunteers who could get off work and go to a meeting in the middle of the work week, right? And this means a lot of them were agency people and getting paid, and industry people getting paid to go to these things and to go to these meetings. And local emergency planning committees were local elites. You know, they were the local poobahs, right? In these meetings. And now, and for example, my LEPC in Washington, D.C. was headed by the fire chief, you know, a government agency, right? Fire chief. Can you imagine how many fire chiefs have been hired in the United States? And we've got lots of them, at least 5,000 or so. How many fire chiefs in the United States have been hired because they promised the local city council, I promise to get up in front of this community and tell them that we live in a really dangerous place? Right, 0. You never heard of one that would say that, right? In fact, none of them will. In fact, this is a religion, the LEPCs. I mean, you might enjoy going to one of the sessions. I mean, it's not a Catholic religion, it's not a Protestant religion or a Jewish religion, but it's a religion because at the beginning of every meeting and at the end of every meeting, they all get up and hold hands. Well, I'm sort of embellishing on this a little bit. And they say, they chant the LEPC mantra, which is, today I will not alarm the public. They just won't do it. And so I'm not encouraging, I never encourage environmentalists to go and join an LEPC. You might want to sit in on one and ask them, well, sir, when do you actually intend to show the local community vividly the worst case scenarios of the most dangerous chemical facilities in our town? And they're going to say, well, they don't have to do it, you see. They don't get paid to do it. There's no mandate. They do it with worst case scenarios. I mean, the worst case scenario information comes to them, but if they don't do it, and they could even stop meeting. They don't go to jail. It's just no damn mandate there. So in any case, we're starting off with a government that hardly works as a real government, you know, in the first place, at all levels. And luckily, periodically, there's a disaster of a kind like the East Palestine has been, where it really generates a lot of interest in, well, could it happen here? And so periodically we get that, but the overall situation is that the community right to know, we can say it's as American as apple pie. We've had community right to know. Congress said Americans have the right to know what risks they're exposed to back in 1986 and in 1990 with our two community right to know laws. But the question is, who's going to make that a reality? Who's going to get up in the public and actually do that? And I can't be optimistic that anybody should try to get their local emergency planning committee to do it, but you should find out that they won't do it, you know. But what we need is real tough. Now that the Biden administration is in there, they need to reverse some of the deregulation on chemical safety that the Trump administration did, and I can outline some of that stuff if you want. But basically, the Trump people tried to move, do their chemical industry friends of big favors and deregulate a bunch of stuff on chemical safety and on transporting of LNG by rail, for example. And Biden is now in the process of trying to redo some of that. So we ought to be supportive about that. And get messages into our representatives to support the Biden administration's efforts to reverse the bad stuff that Trump did. But it's a big, I mean, what we really need is some new national chemical safety laws that actually allow the government to force the companies to use safer technologies, not just to study their plant and identify safer technologies that might be used, but actually use them. And that's where we're not at. I mean, we've never been able to get a consensus of government folks that would sponsor something like that in the Congress. But that's where we are now, and we ought to be at least optimistic that the Obama administration, they're going to definitely contradict a whole bunch of Trump rules, like, you know, the Trump administration on LNG by rail, for example, the Trump administration. As soon as it got in, they started working on a new federal rule to open up the whole U.S. rail system to LNG by rail. It was unprecedented. For decades and decades, LNG has not been allowed to be on the U.S. rail system. There was hardly any market for it anyway, but I mean, it was a very tiny part of the U.S. energy picture until very recently. It was just a small part, but it was also considered too dangerous, so it was never allowed, except with some kind of special permit like they have in Florida, but I can tell you about that if you want. But in any case, so the Trump administration passed a regulation, and you're going to like this part. They were doing their rulemaking, and in the rulemaking process, they have to do some environmental studies and whatnot about the impacts of this rule and try to show that it's rational, you know, and everything. And so, for example, they had to answer this question: is there a real market for LNG by rail? And their evidence was so weak. Their evidence was, well, some industry people tell us that if we can get LNG onto the rail lines, that some people might be interested. There was no market for it. And they, even when they passed that rule, just like in Canada passed a similar rule several years before that, I talked to the Canadian guy who sneaked in a rule into the Canadian regulations to allow LNG on their rail system. And I asked him, so how many trains of LNG have you had on your system since you did that rule? Not one. There's no market for it. It's just a favor to the oil and gas industry, and it's very damn dangerous. And so Obama's going to, I mean, the Biden administration is going to reverse that. But that's just, you know, what we ought to get them to do is very proactive chemical safety regulation and chemical transportation regulation. I don't know whether you guys want to mainly focus on one or the others of those or not, but that's the challenge we have in front of us right now.
So Fred, this is Mark Lundholm, the climate change guy that's heading this up, or got you on along with Jerry. I did participate a little bit. The EPA was running a program along with public health and FEMA and Department of, Department of Defense to run air monitors in big cities daily and bring reports to the public health departments just to see if there was something going on out there. I assume that's still being done, but, probably Trump tried to defund it. But I thought that was a really good thing. Are there other things going on like that out there? Are there things we should be lobbying? We should be getting people trained in and so on and so forth. What can we do on the positive side?
I have to confess that I'm basically an expert on safety and security, but I have always left to other environmental groups, Sierra Club and Greenpeace and others, who have picked up all the other kinds of issues, including sort of routine toxic pollution from plants, air pollution, water pollution, the kind of stuff that people in East Palestine are getting a big dose of, from the big fire that they had there, and also climate change. I mean, basically, I'm the gloom and doom, explosion and fire guy, right? And so I really don't know what the current situation. I can't sort of speak to that. Although, just in general, you have to understand that these are industries that we have in our society that are mainly convinced that if they don't operate secretly, they're not going to be allowed to operate. They have to basically try to operate as secretly as possible in terms of what their risks are. And so they would, to impose on the chemical industry any kind of real workable system of toxic air monitoring around their facilities is a big damn deal. Now, in a few places in the country, there have been some successes in local communities, like in some Louisiana communities where, especially when the environmental justice movement came along, and they could prove that environmental justice communities, poor and minority people, were suffering the worst from routine emissions. I mean, routine meaning flares and all kinds of terrible. I mean, they just, anytime the industry gets into trouble with their process, well, they just flare it off. I mean, that just means they burn it and then the products go into the community, or they just release it. I mean, basically, they got many. One of the reasons why the LNG industry and a lot of the chemical industry is located in the Gulf states, you won't be surprised to hear, is that they have very friendly regulators down in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi in general. Now, when they tried to put an LNG facility in Mobile Bay, Alabama, they had an uprising there of people who didn't want a really dangerous LNG facility in their town. They moved it over to Texas. I mean, Texas and Louisiana are getting right now a huge influx of expansions of LNG facilities and new LNG facilities. Because why? Because even the Biden administration has bought into this idea that, well, our European allies have done a good thing by cutting off Russian gas that was coming in quite cheap by pipeline from Russia into Europe, right? I mean, they did a good thing. They cut off the Russian gas. They're no longer dependent on Russian gas. And so they're looking for LNG as the salvation, the silver bullet to take the place of the Russian gas. And so even the Biden administration is saying, okay, now we have to send as much LNG to our European allies as we can. And that's just a political reality of from how they see it. I mean, the climate change folks and all of us who are concerned about LNG as a hugely expanding industry, we're not just worried about the gloom and doom fires and explosions possibilities. We're worried about the fact that adopting a new LNG industry means you pay for plants that are going to be lasting 30 years. I mean, an LNG plant is designed to last 30 years. And so even investors are kind of worried about that. Like, really, I mean, with all those damn climate change people out there raising so much hell about fossil fuels, are we really going to have an LNG industry in 30 years? I mean, they ought to be worried, but we'll see, right? And you have to spend a huge amount of money to build an LNG plant. It takes a long time to build one. And once they get it in place, they're going to be in the friendliest part of the country to keep going. So climate change people are very worried about LNG. All the national environmental groups are saying we should not adopt a whole. See, another part of all this is that the current LNG industry is an export industry. In other words, in the old days, back in the 1900 period, in the year 2000, we were an import country. We had several dozen small import facilities bringing LNG from Algeria and Nigeria and Australia and whatnot into our country to be used in places in the country that were not served well by pipeline, especially New England. New England is not served well by the national U.S. gas pipeline industry. So they can't get a whole lot of natural gas up in the winter when they need it in New England. So New England has a giant LNG import facility at Everett, Massachusetts, that brings in giant ships of LNG. And anybody looking at that ship, and especially thinking about the terrorism potential, says to themselves, well, what could happen here? Well, there was a huge furor about that in the Boston area. Kennedy and so forth got involved, but they couldn't really solve that problem. At the end of that congressional hearings and everything, all Congress could ask was, would you please locate LNG facilities in remote areas? Please seek remote siting. That's what Congress came up with. So in any case, I'm just trying to illustrate that we have we have a whole lot of kinds of different problems, and the fossil fuel industry in general is our biggest contributor to lots of chemical risk, but also the climate change risks as well. So we have some alliances to build along those lines.
Well, I suspect that a lot of these chemical manufacturing facilities don't even have properly trained people knowing what they're producing, and they don't have any emergency responsibility, and the people aren't trained in it. And the volunteer fire departments in East Palestine and all over the place, do they have proper PPE, and they don't even know what's being released. We had situations here with ethylene oxide being leaked out and causing cancer all over the place. Finally, the Illinois EPA and the government shut those down, but that kind of stuff is going on all over the place. And somebody mentioned in the chat group underground storage tanks and something. I don't know if you can look at the chat to see if you want to take questions yet, maybe later on. But one of the heroes I found out about early on was Alice Hamilton. You probably know who she was. She was an early doctor in this country. She worked with Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago. She is probably the mother of industrial hygiene, and went around telling people, don't use these things. These will kill people. Don't use these chemicals. She ended up teaching, I think, at Harvard Medical School, but she probably died back in the 1920s and argued against putting lead in gasoline. So way ahead of her time. But one of those people we should follow, and we're still not doing those things.
Well, we have regulations in the chemical industry, and here's why. If you're running a major chemical facility or transportation situation, you have to be able to plausibly produce, in case of a serious accident, you have to be able to plausibly produce that you have complied with the industry standards, which are called minimal guidance standards. Okay, they're voluntary, but they're minimal guidance standards. And you have to comply with all available government regulations. I mean, that's just because you're trying to defend yourself against terrible lawsuits, right? And huge settlements. And so the industry lawyers really do try to lobby. And on the one hand, they all get together in an organization called the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA. That's where they produce industry standards, voluntary industry standards. Like for LNG, it's NFPA 59A. Every 4 years, they come out with a new version of the industry standards, and they work hard on this. I mean, these are high-paid industry experts and lawyers who get together in meetings after meetings after meetings, year-round, all the time, and they come up with these new guidance standards like NFPA 59A. Which then the industry can then say, well, okay, it's voluntary, but any really deep pockets industry doesn't want to get sued for all of their money, so they try to follow those standards, and they want to be able to argue that they are. Now, on the one hand, then they try to get their own standards adopted into the government's regulations. It's called incorporation by reference. We have not had. This is just an example of what you were talking about. We have not had a comprehensive set of LNG regulations, safety regulations, LNG facility safety regulations since 1980. We're still operating with a standards that govern the old little import plants. Okay, and we've got now a new whole much more dangerous industry called the LNG export industry that's growing up in Texas and Louisiana with a lot of huge risk. And we've not and all the government does is sort of take a look at the industry standards and then adopt some of them into the regulations, but they've not actually done a comprehensive look in a very long time. Now, luckily for us, the DOT, the U.S. PHMSA and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, held a conference in 2016, which is called it was called Workshop on Natural Gas Regulation. And what they were announcing as an agency was, we need to have new comprehensive regulations for this new export industry that we're building in the United States. And so, which the industry now views. What happened in the meantime was, instead of being an importer of gas, we discovered all this frack gas out in North Dakota and South Dakota, an enormous amount of easily recoverable fracked gas, and as well as fracked oil, but fracked gas. And so fracked gas now enable the U.S. to be an exporter of gas in the rest of the world instead of an importer. So we were desperate to sell our damn fracked gas that was coming out of the ground in enormous amounts to anybody who would buy it. And so we try to horn in and on our allies in Europe and say, you need to be buying American LNG. See, the only way that you can sell natural gas efficiently is to refrigerate it into LNG. And what that does is take the natural gas and refrigerate it into a liquid. And when the liquid turns back into a gas, it expands 600 times. The gas volume is 600 times greater than the liquid. So liquefied natural gas can be shipped by truck and by rail and by ship over all around the world in a way that natural gas is not economical to do. Natural gas is mainly economical by pipeline. So basically, we had a situation where we had this new export industry. Now in 2015, that conference that was held by the U.S. Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration had actually funded a British safety agency called the Health and Safety Executive to do a study of big vapor cloud explosions around the world. And they came up with a list of 24 giant explosions vapor cloud explosions means that you have a chemical on the plant site that's a liquid, and then there's a release and it turns into a vapor. And the way LNG works, way these kinds of gases work is that when the liquid release comes up, then it boils furiously and picks up heat from either the ground or the water that is falling onto, and then forms this giant vapor cloud. Well, then the cloud can either be ignited immediately into a huge fire, or the worst case scenario is the vapor cloud could not be is not ignited immediately, and instead forms a vapor cloud that climbs over the fence and into the nearby community and then blows up in the community. Now, that's the real worst case scenario about these kinds of vapor cloud explosions. And so basically, when Trump when Trump passed a final rule on LNG by rail, he had to to allow LNG to go throughout the rail system in railroad tank cars. He had to do an environmental study like this, and his staff people did, and they did say, well, yeah, we can now say that a railroad tank car could release its contents and into a vapor cloud that could move some distance into a community. But the way you have to study that, the way you have to calculate that is there are a lot of complex gas models that you could be using here. And so it's, quote, difficult, and they wouldn't do it. In the rulemaking for LNG by rail, they admit that a release cloud would go into a nearby community near the rail line, and they wouldn't say how far or what the impacts would be. They just said it's too difficult. I mean, when I say this is an industry that depends on secrecy, that's just one example of that. They don't think they can exist if the public knows how dangerous they are. And they got a point. It's true. The chlorine gas industry that used to supply chlorine gas to sewage plants has gone away. There's just no industry like that anymore, because people are using bleach and other alternatives. So it's our job, of course, to raise the concern, to basically illustrate the risk as vividly as we can. Worst case accident scenarios, worst case release scenarios, whether by accident or by terrorism, is the way that we can do that, mainly in local communities and in legislatures that we want to regulate these chemicals. What
does the insurance industry doing about any of this? Do the industry just self-insure, or? The industries, a lot of chemical corporations might be somewhat self-insured, but they also buy a lot of insurance. And I was hopeful to learn. I was hopeful that I would learn that the insurance industry experts would be a force for safer practices, right? And I think to some extent they do. If they found out that some company was actually still sending chlorine gas tank cars 4 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, their insurers would probably raise bloody hell about that. But the insurance industry is not a safety regulator. They are not designed to tell a company how to be safer. They are only designed to tell a company, if you operate in these ways that you've explained to us, here's what your premium will be for us. You will pay us a higher premium if you're less safe. But if you want to be less safe, okay, just pay us a higher premium, a higher insurance premium. And the catastrophic risk for the insurance company, the calculation for that gets blended in with all other kinds of comprehensive risks, so that this is basically a negotiation between a risk-imposing chemical company and a risk-insuring insurance industry, and all their documents are secret. It's all proprietary information. And right now, the situation is that the industry tries to keep as much of its information proprietary. And even now, when the major LNG facilities are giving their information to the U.S. government, they submit it to the U.S. government with a stamp at the top of every page, proprietary or privileged. My friend Dr. Jerry Havens is the main LNG expert in the country, from the University of Arkansas, and he recently got hold of some government agency documents about LNG, because he was trying to figure out whether they were being honest in their calculations or not. Well, when he got to the page that was really important, there was a list of calculations that went down the page, and next to every one of them it said privilege. This is a government industry document that he got. Beside every list, it said privilege, privilege, privileged, privilege, privilege. In other words, it was redacted and secret. The industry in the country, you have to admit, is a great boon to the black ink industry in the country, because they just buy a whole lot of black ink for their own documents and for the government documents. They just really support that black ink industry. They're really patriotic.
The only way I see to really address this is, from the perspective of an elected official, that those industries can make or break a political career, and they can't do anything good unless they stay in office. It's going to take us being active and voting for issues that politicians are going to support, and we need to be their guarantee that they will stay in office. That's what we need to do. There is a way that we can address this, but we're going to have to be much more active, much more organized, and very clearly message what we want from them and what we want them to do once elected, and then we need to keep them there.
I agree with that. And one thing that's helpful is to know that there's a whole range of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofit groups that are organized around these kinds of issues. So I encourage every group of citizens to locate and ally with the groups in their states who are already operating on some of these kinds of issues and join in with them. I mean, you could be the you could be the local chapter of the Sierra Club or the Environmental Defense Fund or the National Wildlife Federation or any number of environmental groups that work on these issues, Friends of the Earth and so forth. I mean, there are ways of maximizing your power by joining in with other groups that already have some organization. Some of those groups are funded by foundations that think the way we do, that damn it, this is not acceptable. The kind of risk that we're being imposed upon by these industries is not acceptable, and they don't like the power that the industry has over the government. And so many nonprofit groups would be eager to have your folks join in, and that way you kind of learn from their lessons. And I mean, that's basically how I came up. I basically was being a college professor, but then I joined Friends of the Earth and just learned by leaps and bounds what you could do in terms of being an environmental lobbyist. I mean, and I helped to write one of the national chemical safety laws, and was a lobbyist and worked with community groups around the country. But if you try to do it on your own, there's just no reason why you should have to be doing it all on your own when there are groups that have been working on this stuff for a long time, especially in areas of major chemical facilities.
I'd also like to point out that we've got Fritz Edler online here. He works with Railroad Workers United. He's a special representative in Washington, D.C. And I don't know, Fritz, maybe you might have some ideas in terms of what people can push for to try to. One thing that, when I first found out about this issue, my immediate reaction is keep it in the ground. We have to stop doing this. And I've come to peace with the fact that if and when, I still think that needs to happen, but it's going to be a gradual phase. I mean, even me who, I don't want anything anything, but, I only have so much money to, purchase a new car, electric car, or, electric or solar panels. So it's going to take time. But when I spoke to Fritz, he's very adamant that the railroads can do this safely, and I know him well enough that I trust that that's true. I think we're all in different places with this, but I do think we need to have these conversations about what do they need and what can we help them with. Fritz, is there anything you want to comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, I like Fritz, and I've met, I've worked with him some in the past, and Railroad Workers United is a great group. I mean, that's something that's a group you could learn to be allies with. They actually have been on the right side of lots of these issues, because their railroad workers are the first ones who are at risk in terms of a terrible chemical release. We had an accident. A chlorine gas tank car accident in Graniteville, South Carolina, many years ago, where the railroad workers were the main victims of it because the chlorine gas got out before they could run away from their own train. And so basically we do have a lot in commonalities with them, and they would be allies in a lot of these kinds of things. Let me mention that it's probably true that you can say that the railroads can carry these cargoes safely, but there are some limitations on that. And so what we want to be doing is, I mean, I was appalled that in reading all the Washington Post coverage of the East Palestine derailment, people will spend most of their time talking about what we can do about detectors on the track or hot boxes and this kind of stuff. And in 3 weeks, there was not one word about rerouting the most dangerous cargoes around the most dense populations. Not one person was suggesting. Now it's true, because that's not going to help East Palestine, which is a little tiny town, right? But it might help Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Philly or wherever this train was going and coming from. And so the point is, rerouting is an absolutely major basic safety thing, and it's not happening. and so when that issue gets, well, when people start to be serious about how can you make trains safer, one of the things they mention is trains should slow down, you know, and then the railroad industry pushes back on that. And I saw a big national meeting where the regulators were talking about new regulations to slow down trains and the chemical trains. And the railroad guy, the top Ed Hamburger, the top CEO of the Association of American Railroads, got up in his session, and just before him, the federal government agency had presented their expert, whose name was Carl Alexie. Carl Alexie with the Federal Railroad Administration said to this big group, this big industry and public group conference, that they had done a limited number of field tests with railroad tank cars and in a puncture test. And what that means is you have a railroad tank car that has water in it. Lord knows they can't spend the money for chemicals, but the FRA had gotten enough funding to do 6 field tests where you ram a puncture kind of thing into the tank car and see if it punctures, right? And they had done 6 of these. Well, industry people kind of snickered and said, "Oh, Carl, you could only do 6 tests, you know? Well, what kind of a test?" Look, they talked to the federal government. Federal government doesn't have much budget for any of this stuff. So, but Carl stood his ground and said, "Here's what we found out. What we found out is that if you have these cars loaded with these loaded cars in the U.S. rail system, and they're operating, quote, at speed, meaning 40 to 50 miles per hour for freight trains in the U.S. rail system," he said, "you cannot build a tank car that will withstand punctures at that speed. You cannot." Now, see, this is not something that you hear from very much industry people, but industry people, and I'll tell you what the industry said, but Carl said it quite convincingly. Nobody said that's not true. They had done testing on different thicknesses of railroad tank cars, and he said, at railroad speeds, you cannot build a tank car that will withstand punctures at that speed. And a derailment, of course, where this tank car is jumbling all over and hitting bridges and everything, right? So then it was followed by the railroad guy, Ed Hamburger, AAR, who got up and said, and you know, he's like the prince, right? He practically needs to wear a ring every time he gets up. And he said to the audience, he said, "Now look, fellas, you know, one of our main clients for freight railroad in this country is UPS, United Parcel Service. They need to get things out there fast. If we slow down all of our chemical trains in the country, we'll be slowing down UPS's trains. Does anybody out here want that?" And that was the end of the discussion.
Fritz, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that. And then I see Nicole Salisbury.
First of all, I always appreciate northwest suburbs of Chicago and Indivisible because of the programs that they have put on. And I've been proud to be on the same platform with Fred Millar on various occasions over the many years. And these are important questions to take up. But I would have to say that there are some important differences. And one of those things is the fact that, for example, so because Railroad Workers United, my own organization, operates in the United States and in Canada, one of the things that we understand is the difference of the way that things operate there. And in Canada, everything, unlike the US, tends to be more about the question of you're either really pro-pipeline or you're pro-oil by rail. And in the US, it's more like you're anti, you're pro keep it in the ground versus moving it in some way. The fact of the matter is that in both countries, all across the North American continent, that we have to figure out how to do this stuff safely. And we also have to figure out how to not do it. We have to figure out how to get to the place where we don't do it. And the big question is if you don't do it by rail, are you going to build an entirely new, brand new, financed infrastructure that is dedicated only to the movement of whatever that thing is, and then have to justify it and finance it and make sure that it happens going forward. The alternative, of course, is that as railroad workers, myself and all my colleagues in North America, there are ways that we can do this. We know this from around the world. We know that there are ways that this can be done. You know, Fred, we really appreciate Fred in the sense of his deep dive into the regulatory stuff, which brings to the fore all kinds of questions that have to be addressed. Speed is one. Containers are one. What can we do? It gets back to the fact that on July 6th of this year, we're going to have the 10th anniversary of the Lac-Mégantic wreck. Fred already talked about it on this conversation you're having tonight. After 10 years, there's a bunch of things that we know that we didn't know before, although, obviously we could be aware of them and be concerned about them. One of those things is the fact that when they had the trials, the criminal trials, which I was directly involved in Canada, about who was going to be responsible for those things, the government produced 40 witnesses about how things were done, and every single one of those government witnesses that were supposed to prove that it was the individual's responsibility, they spilled the beans. They spilled the beans on the real way that the private railroads operate and the way that the private railroads do these things. So, there's various ways we can look at this, and one of them that is presented by various people is that it is the question of whether we're going to leave it in the ground, quote unquote, whatever versions of that there are, leave it in the ground. In other words, we're not going to move the volatiles at all, or are we going to move it? And then the question is, are we going to move it? Are we going to move it on the rails, or are we going to build a brand new freaking infrastructure that is dedicated to that and has to be sustained for that? We do know how to do this. We don't want to do it. It's not our goal to do it. We don't want longer. We don't want heavier. We don't want all of the various kinds of violations that we've seen that has to do with what came out in the trial in Lac-Mégantic. But the fact of the matter is that for the time being, we're going to have to move some of this stuff. We can do it safer. Fred talked about the volatiles, the various gases and components of fracked gases. Well, one of the things that we know is that they don't have to ship that by rail. That's an asked and answered question. We already know the answer to that, but they want to do it. They want to ship it that way because it's a profit center. The big problem here is that you cannot trust the private railroads to do the right thing. My own organization and many others, a lot of other organizations across the country and across the continent are starting to say, well, what we have to do is we have to operate the railroads in the public interest. And this is one of the things that hasn't come up in this conversation. If we want to be able to move these things in a way that protects all of the people here, not just the rail workers, but the communities that are trackside and whatnot. For example, in the East Palestine situation, Fred talked about the ECP brakes. Well, ECP brakes would have possibly made that wreck much, 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 much less dangerous. Also, if we'd made it less long, if we had blocked it in a different way. But we know how to do those things. This is not rocket science. We've known how to do this stuff for a very long time. The reason why the dangerous things and the bad things happen is because of the way that the private railroads and their captured regulators decide to do things. So I would just say that, between now and the 6th of July, which is the 10th anniversary of the Lac-Mégantic wreck, and the Lac-Mégantic wreck encompasses all of the worst problems, the worst decisions, the worst policies, the worst regulations, the worst of everything. Between now and the 6th of July, this is our opportunity to engage the public in this conversation and figure out how to do this. there's no way we're going to not move these products. Let's move them safely. And the way to move them safely is to have the people who know how to do it and the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, be involved. Right now, that's not happening.
And I did put some information about the 10th anniversary Memorial March and a trip to DC. If anybody's interested, please feel free to email me and I can get you more information. Nicole Salisbury, you've had your hand up for a long time. You want to ask a question?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good to see you, Jerry. You know, it's been a while. But maybe forgive me if I missed this, but I was just wondering if the railroads were just as secretive as the chemical industry, and also about what is being done about, I guess, to upgrade the railway infrastructure through the Infrastructure Act.
Well, the railroad industry is the carriers for the chemical industry. I mean, they are the chemical industry's carriers, and so that they basically serve the chemical industry, and they're often allies in their lobbying in Congress and so forth. I mean, the industry and the railroads are almost always on the same side. Fritz, I was glad to hear from Fritz, and one thing he didn't mention was that another aspect of the recklessness of the private industry, both the chemical companies and the railroads, is that they're pushing now to be able to reduce the number of workers on a train. I mean, there's a big fight around the country and in various states about whether you can operate a huge long train safely with just one, or you need at least two workers. And we've had two for quite a while in most places in the country. I'm not an expert on this, but I know that's a big fight. And of course, the railroad workers say that, look, the railroads, especially in the Trump administration era, have gotten much longer, much heavier, much harder to handle. And to think that you can now downgrade your on-train staff from 2 to 1, you know, and think that one person can handle a train that's 2 or 3 miles long is just fantasy. I mean, it's just completely reckless. Well, the industry says, oh, we've got wonderful computers now, and we don't need to have 2 people on a train.
They don't want anybody to run the train. They want to just run by computer.
I understand.
That's one suggestion too. Cole Bennett has a hand up. Cole, unmute and
Hi guys. My name is Cole. It's so nice to meet both you guys talking about such an important issue. You guys have been talking about a lot of the national conversation that's been going on with the rail industry. What can be done, or what are some improvements that can occur at the state or local level to help with this issue?
Well, one of the powerful things that the railroads did was ensure that railroad safety regulation would be entirely a federal matter. It's federally preempted. States and localities can do virtually nothing except maybe have, you know, nicely colored track crossings. Okay, I mean, states and localities are preempted by very heavy-handed federal law, and that's where the industry can focus their lobbying in terms of getting what they want. And it's been that way for decades and decades and decades. And the industry
that goes back to Jerry's comment about the railroad police. The railroad police appear to have complete jurisdiction over everybody regarding their rail properties and their infrastructure. Is that true?
And they answer to the railroads, not to the public.
Well, I'm just focusing on the safety side of it, which is, you know, I mean, here we have a public that is widely being put at great risk, and they are being kept in the dark in various ways. I mean, you probably can't find a local emergency planning committee in Illinois or anywhere that has vigorously studied the risks of the trains coming through, because they don't have to under the federal EPCA law. The railroads got themselves exempted, and the railroads they might come in and, you know, kind of grandly offer to make a presentation to an LEPC, but if you start asking them really sharp questions, this is the new kind of secrecy, or the new footing for secrecy, is nowadays in the last 20 years, what they tell you is well, sir, you know, we wish we could inform you about those risks to you, but it's a terrorism question, you know. It's a secrecy, it's a security question. It's not just a safety question. We can't tell, we don't want to tell you what most hazardous cargoes are that we bring through your community. Now, we might whisper those words a little bit, some information to your local emergency responders, you know, your fire chief and your hazmat team or something, but only under the condition that they not tell the public. And so, see, the fire department now and the local emergency response management agency, they become like partners with the industry and keeping the public in the dark. But they feel like the insiders.
After an accident happened.
Well, even before, no, I mean, basically the whole idea is that the railroads can now claim, like the chemical industry does, that we are not going to tell you what the most dangerous chemicals are on our plant site, even though their tanks are clearly placarded. Okay, I mean they need that for their on-site workers and emergency response teams. I mean, imagine a chemical tank car is 30,000 gallons coming through your town, and it's clearly placarded, and they think that terrorists can't figure out what to attack. I mean, this is completely phony, but it's the most basic thing that they have convinced local officials and state officials to just back off, because what are you trying to endanger? Are you trying to endanger your community by telling them what the most dangerous chemical plant in town is? Well,
I had conversations with with representatives from the Illinois CERC and the Lake County and McHenry County LEPCs. The CERC told me, the State Emergency Response Commission, that there's a list of nearly 400 chemicals, and we can expect that all of them at some point can be rolling through our communities at any given moment. The LEPCs that you would go through your county to get information about that. Lake County only has 3 paid staff. McHenry County only has 4 paid staff. They estimated, I asked them about emergency response for schools, because we have all kinds of school children at risk because the schools are located right next to these railroad tracks. And they said they estimated it would take a team of about 8 paid staff 2 years just to locate them, let alone figure out what a 4-corner evacuation plan would be. And actually Nicole Salisbury, she was part of that conversation. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, but in order to evacuate, I want to make sure that you kind of separate. I've heard you, Fred, say that emergency response is a waste of time. And I understand why you say that, because once it blows, either you're dead or hopefully you're running away from the incident. But there is evacuation. For example, if I'm going to bring a group of school children outside for a drill, we're going to leave all doors, all the way around the building we're going to come out of. And that's not what you want to do if there's been a spill or, a fire. You want to go upwind, and you need plans in place. You've got students with special needs, students who will need medication. You need to know where you're going to bring these kids, what buses are going to be available in case of an emergency evacuation. All these things need to be planned ahead of time. Nicole did get some legislation introduced last session, but it met with a lot of opposition from the chemical companies, the rail companies, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, but my understanding was that if it were to move to the floor, it would have died because of the opposition, and we needed stakeholder support, which we're still working on. But where is that going to come from? It's not going to come from the railroads. It's not going to come from, or I should say, the rail industry. We did get a resolution adopted by Railroad Workers United. Thank you, Fritz, for helping us out with that. And we're trying to go through unions, but it's not going to be the chemical companies.
You actually made my point, and I really agree with a lot of what you said about, I mean, if every school needs to have a good emergency response plan and people trained and practicing and having kids learn how to do evacuations and take shelter someplace, et cetera. But what my main point is, emergency planning is never taken seriously at the local level. The reason that the Right to Know law in 1986 invented a whole new institution of local emergency planning committees was that they looked at the emergency management agencies in communities and said, they're just a bunch of hacks. They don't do anything. They're not funded. They're not experts, and they don't do anything. They just have a job. They're called the Emergency Management Agency. But Congress and the world in general viewed that whole profession as a bunch of do-nothing hacks. And so they did this end run with the local emergency planning committees. It was a noble experiment, but they don't get funded very well at all. They don't get taken seriously. I mean, try to find a community where, even a small community, where a local emergency management agency has held a drill on an LNG, on a chemical release, either from a facility or from a rail tank car, and then involve the community, like you involve your children, in an actual evacuation drill. They just won't do it. They just don't do it, and they won't do it because there's no local official that's willing to get up in public and let the public know that we live in a really dangerous town here.
And, well, I was just going to say, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
The number one thing, in my opinion, that we should have learned from East Palestine was, because our local, our LEPCs have no clue what they're doing, or any other, the fire department or whatever, what ends up happening is the railroads come in and they set up their own incident command centers. And that is why, they run and control the entire narrative. And they are exactly the ones that don't want you to know what's spilled. They don't want you to know how many people could be impacted, yet they're telling the governor what to say. They're telling the EPA what to say and what tests to do and where to do the tests. That we do not want that.
But that's because they have the experts, they have the money, and they buy the experts. And even if the government hires a few experts and the experts start to get some real knowledge about these kinds of things, guess where they go and get more money? They go and join the industry and get more money. It's a revolving door. So the local emergency planning industry, the whole profession is very, very weak. And I'm just suggesting that it's more important to start to build your own non-governmental organization strength and not try to either have any hope in the local emergency planning committee. Local emergency planning is important, but it's really, really difficult to make any of it happen. Let me mention one other tool that you might have never heard of, no doubt, and which I think it would be good. I just learned more about this recently. It turns out that back in the day, when the U.S. agencies were worried about terrorism, that Congress and a lot of other people tried to put limitations on community right to know, and they tried to erase it, like make community right to know sound like, oh, that is so dangerous. You can't have the community know anything, or you'll be helping those terrorists out there. And who knows how many people in the community are terrorists, right? And so US EPA, which did care about community right to know, and the US Department of Justice put together a final rule, an actual federal final rule to teach local officials how you can communicate risk to the public without violating security problems. And here's how they did it. It's a beautiful document. It's just completely unknown. It's disappeared into the ether, right? It's been suppressed. But what it does is it teaches local government what they can do. What they say is you can get up in a public meeting and you can describe the documents that you get from the chemical industry in a kind of generalized way. And I hope some state officials will take a look at this and try to educate local officials on how to do this. You can get up in a public meeting and you can describe in a generalized way what kinds of chemical risks exist in your community. As long as you don't put that information into any kind of format that could be easily spread on the internet worldwide. As long as you don't put it into any kind of, in other words, you can't produce Excel charts or anything that could be easily put onto the internet and spread to a lot of other people, including terrorists. I mean, it is a very brilliant document because on the one hand, they say we're balancing the community's right to know versus security concerns. And what we decided was, as long as the information is being spread in a generalizable way that is not easily spread on the internet, it's okay. It is. Now, you can't find a set of local officials who know that or who are teaching anybody about that. I can't point to you a single example of where that's happened in the United States ever since that time, ever since 2000. There's nobody who knows about it, but I'm just telling you, it's there. As far as I know, it's still a federal law, and it makes eminent sense. What that means is you have to find some state or local government officials who are willing to actually give that a go, and take the documents that are already available in the local emergency planning committee, and find ways of discussing those documents and those risks.
No, don't put it on the internet. So we got a hand up, Jim McGrath.
Yeah, quick question. With everything that we've talked about tonight, is there, and I think I always come with this question, is there any legislation, either at the state or federal level, with bill numbers that we should be supporting or against?
Well, right now, I think, the problem is that there have been some recent congressional legislation, like the FAST Act and so forth, that put a lot of new legislative mandates on the federal agencies. And so, in other words, they're supposed to come up with new regulations on LNG, and they know they're supposed to reverse the Trump administration's regulations on all kinds of things, both in chemical industry facilities and in transportation. And they're starting to do that. I mean, I've had some calls from federal officials who are working on those issues, and they've actually announced. I mean, one of the first things that the Biden administration did when it came in was to promptly suspend the Trump administration's rule on the LNG going out into the whole U.S. rail system. I mean, they just promptly said, that's a dead letter. We're suspending that, and we're going to work on a new rule. Now, working on a new rule means some agency staffers have to spend quite a lot of time coming up with the rationales and the documentation, and they're going to produce some of the maps and whatnot that the Trump administration refused to produce because it's too difficult, But I mean, so they've got a lot on their plate. So I would suggest that states and localities cannot act on rail safety. And so I don't know of any sort of federal law right now that we need to that has a number. The EPA, I'm sorry, the EPA first person I talked to recently said our new rule on risk management planning is almost finished. And so we're going to be putting out a proposed rule fairly quickly. And that's the rule that overturns some of the Trump rules on what a local emergency planning committee can communicate to the public and all that. But I mean, it's like I say, they've just got a lot on their plate. So you might just try to talk to the national groups and find and look at their websites, the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC, and they will be your first. They have Washington staffs, and they will be your first glimpse of what is possible for you to get your people to support.
Thank you.
Another hand up here, Charles. Charles?
Yes, sir. Mr. Millar, Charles Praddock here with the Chicago Greens. Two-part question. Chicago had services 6 of the 7 major railroads. Isn't rerouting going to, is that hardly even achievable? And wouldn't that generate significant opposition? And the second part is, does rerouting really constitute a hazard abatement of a tank car product? Thank you. Good Good to
Okay,
talk
no,
with you.
look, I mean, anybody from Chicago should be the most interested in this question of anybody in the country, because you're the man, you are the place where these railroads converge, right? Now, I have occasionally seen in the trade press, the railroad trade press, that some chemical industry person is bragging about how he is serving his customers better now because he has found a way of rerouting around those congested Chicago rail yards. You got a whole bunch of very congested Chicago rail yards that people pull out their hair trying to get through with trains, right? And so basically, I mean, but this is like what guy can do in his own commercial benefit, right? There's nobody out there in the railroad industry saying, we want to reroute around Chicago for safety reasons. And God knows they don't want a government telling them to do it. But nonetheless, you're right that there, in the first place, you should know there are ways to go around Chicago. There are ways to go around Washington, D.C. and go through Luray, Virginia instead. There are ways.
And you made the point that they don't have to build new infrastructure to do this. They could do this through those
interchange agreements, which they already do 1 million times a year. Now, look, I mean, in other words, this is just nonsense that we can't do a serious rerouting regulation. It would be called urban hazmat protective rerouting. Urban hazmat protective rerouting. And basically just tell the railroads, if you can go around, do it. Now, if you haven't, that's what our DC law that I helped write said, that if you have an origin or destination in our town, well, okay, we're not going to interfere with that. But the point is, if you can go around with the most dangerous cargoes, I mean, explain to me why and the railroads will just say, well, you know, I heard a railroad guy say, look, you know, we built our railroads 200 years ago to connect your damn cities, and now you want us to go around? Well, yeah, that's right, we do. We want you to go around. Now that means people in northern Illinois and in other places that are not in Chicago, they might see more dangerous hazmat traffic. But when people say to me, "Oh, this is a moral dilemma, isn't it? You got people at risk in here, and people at risk in the major cities, and people at risk in the small town." I say, "Look, it's not a moral dilemma. Here's my invitation. You go and talk to 10 church pastors or church and synagogue pastors in your town, and you ask them to discuss this question the next Sunday. Do we want our most dangerous cargoes to go through our town or through Chicago?" Now, how many of those upstanding church congregations is going to come out with the answer, "Oh no, we want them to still go through Chicago because, you know, we don't want the risks. Put them through Chicago." The railroads connected Chicago, and that's the reason they go there. Is that's what they did when they had no regulations at all and they really dominated the whole country. They went wherever they wanted to, and if they wanted to all go into Chicago, they just did it. And they would go through St. Louis, and they go through Pittsburgh, and they go through everywhere, you know. But it's not God-given. It's just what they decided to do with their railroads. Now we can now say, look, this is you don't have the same challenge. You now have ways to go around Chicago. I mean, everybody in Chicago should look at a U.S. rail atlas of what the routes are around Chicago, and don't be unknowledgeable when you're talking to a railroad person who says we all converge in Chicago. How can we do? Well, even your own industry people sometimes brag about how smart they are because they found a way to avoid Chicago. Of course they're smart. That saves a hell of a lot of time, and time is money in the railroads. Okay, so we just don't need to be defensive about the value of rerouting. Oh, and let me just finish by saying, when Washington D.C. raised bloody hell, and people, I wish Chicago had done this, but when Washington D.C. raised bloody hell about the chlorine tank cars coming with the U.S. Capitol building 4 blocks in the background under that Sierra Club photo, and the Washington City Council passed a rerouting ordinance, CSX Railroad said grandly with their, as if it was a big favor, okay, well, we're going to voluntarily reroute some of our cargoes out to that other line, Norfolk Southern, as if that was some kind of grand gesture of gratitude, of generosity. as if they didn't already do it a million times a year. But they did reroute for a while. They stopped bringing chlorine and ammonia and hydrogen fluoride and hydrogen cyanide. They stopped bringing some of their most dangerous cargoes because we were taking pictures of them with the Capitol 4 blocks in the background. Now, in Illinois, what would be a good picture? What would be a good picture of a railroad tank car clearly placarded of chlorine or whatever with some city hall or major other, university or whatever in the background?
Chicago skyline. That's it.
Pardon?
The Chicago skyline.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, it helps to have something quite close, but you don't have to have it because, like I said, if you're well informed about this, you can say, in Washington, D.C., the sewage plant actually hired a consultant, the Radian Corporation from Texas, to do their worst case scenario with a railroad tank car. And the results were on page 36 of their document, of their hazard assessment. A lot of industries do hazard assessments because their insurance companies want to know that they've done it. And on page 36, it said, and I showed this to a Washington, D.C. audience, and it said that the cloud from one chlorine tank car could go 40 miles over Washington, D.C., first the Capitol and so forth, and then out over the suburbs. Now, when I got up in public in my LEPC, this is my favorite story, and showed the public this chart. And I was just a small fry on the LEPC, a committee chairperson. I was followed by the fire chief, who stood up in his beautiful blue uniform with braid on his cap and braid down his arms and braid down his pants. And he said in his beautiful baritone voice, "Everything is under control." You can't find a local official who's willing to alarm the public. Everything is under control. See, a fire chief wants to be able to tell people, we got this. You should give us money and you should buy trucks for us and everything because we got this. Everything is under control. Well, the DC Council didn't think that. They voted 9-1 to do a rerouting bill. So I hope
We
that
should
answers the question.
Huh? I was going to say we should probably wrap up, but I want you guys to make sure you take a look at the chat, maybe download it. Fritz had some good comments. Fritz, there is a rail safety bill at the federal level right now. Fritz, do you really very quickly want to talk about? I'm hearing that you guys are not a fan. I'm not a fan because I may be misinterpreting it, but I'm concerned that it might give the railroads permission to basically mandate that they are the ones to set up the incident command centers. That is my concern. That should not be happening. But Fritz, do you really quickly want to touch on that? And then we should probably close here and thank everybody.
Fred may wish to speak on this. I'm speaking specifically of what's called the Rail Safety Bill. It's in the United States Senate. It is a, quote, bipartisan bill. And it is a direct response to what happened in East Palestine. And essentially, our biggest objection to that bill is that it basically says, well, we'll say that the FRA should develop policies to solve these problems. And if the FRA was in a position as a non-captured regulator to do that, we wouldn't be in this place in the first place. Just a little sideline, you may know that in regard to the East Palestine wreck, that the proximate problem is the fact that hot journal detectors are not federally regulated. There's no indication that they're going to change that. There's nothing in that. There's no indication that that's a thing that, I mean, there's at least one other bill that's being circulated, but the big one, the one that everybody's talking about, is the one that is the bipartisan bill that J.D. Vance and Casey and Fetterman and Brown are supporters of, co-sponsors of. And I don't say we should oppose this bill, but it is inadequate. It is completely inadequate to the problems that are at hand, and it basically sidesteps all of the most important problems. What we need to do is regulate. Regulation is the answer here. In Canada, in the Lac-Mégantic wreck and in other situations, the big problem was that the government had decided, in their administrations, both sides, conservatives and liberals, and in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, had decided that they should increasingly let the industry regulate itself. That's how we got here. There's no change in that. The bills don't have a change in that. Right now, we do not have anything in the government that deals with that problem.
One thing I might interject is that we learned in the East Palestine derailment situation that the agreement among emergency response agencies in the whole country is that you should have what's called a unified command. At any kind of emergency situation, there should be a unified command with a fire chief or somebody who is basically in charge, and everybody else comes in to have meetings daily and coordinates and shares information, but everybody's participating under the command of a unified commander. The railroads refuse to do that in East Palestine. They refused to participate in unified command. They just brought in their own experts and started doing everything they wanted to do, which was to
They became it.
clean up. Yeah. So all I'm trying to say is that local officials, at least in the emergency response immediate situations, are in charge. But the railroads are so arrogant that even in the East Palestine situation, with all that media attention in the whole country, no, they just went their own way, and that pissed off a lot of people. So, I haven't seen that new bill, but I'd be happy to have a look at it, and there may be some good stuff in it, because Senator Brown's really a quite good senator. So I'm sure but what we don't want is bills in the Congress, where they say we want to move from a 2-person crew on a train to a 1-person crew on a train.
So let's maybe we can wrap this up here. But Fred, I want to thank you so much for coming on here. It starts to open eyes for people, I hope. And if there are ways for right-thinking people or good-thinking people to participate in getting good legislation, or if you see something where we can participate, there are going to be a lot of people listening to this presentation, and maybe we can foment some interest and some good legislation out of it. And thanks, Fritz, for coming on too. And Jerry is always helping line this up. We really appreciate it. And I hope we can touch base with you later on. If you think of something, please reach out to us, because, we're here trying to do stuff. There are a lot of people listening. And so that's it from me. Anybody else have any questions? I thought Cole had his hand up, but otherwise, I'm not sure. Bill, do you want to say anything?
Thank you very much to Northwest Suburbs Indivisible for what you do.
You're welcome.
It was my privilege to participate, guys. So keep up the good work.
Yep. Come back on anytime.
Yeah. Mark, I want to thank you and Jerry and everybody for getting this organized here. Fred, you were great. Fred, I thought great comments. It gives you a lot to think about. Of course, always when we talk about climate change, it gives you a lot to think about.
So, and for those who didn't know, Bill Davis is one of our co-chairs of NWSOFA-Indivisible. So he's the kind of guy that sort of organizes all these issue groups, and thanks to him too. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming.